actions. And we're also going to be recording the meeting so that it's available afterwards, because there's just that much good information that I'm sure you're going to want to watch this again and again. So let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'm Laura Salerno Owens. I'm the president of Markowitz Herbold, which is a boutique litigation firm. We do business and commercial litigation based out of Portland. And I'm the chair of the firm's employment practice group. So in that area, I help employers and executives with issues around non-competition agreements, non-solicit, discrimination issues, pay issues, all the joys that come up with employing someone or being an executive yourself. I also have a commercial litigation practice, or as I like to tell people, when businesses fight about money. And so that kind of covers all sorts of issues, partnership disputes, contract issues, etc. So that is what we do. And I'm very excited to be presenting with my friend Pam. So Pam, why don't you introduce yourself briefly to the group before we get started?
Sure, I'm Pam Mack. I am president of Occuscreen, and we are a boutique employment screening company. So the boutiques are working together today. So we have over 30 years of experience in helping employers nationwide to hire with a little more confidence by providing criminal background checks and drug testing and other related screening services. And who knew we'd be in the COVID testing business at some point? That was a surprise, but here we are. So I'm going to turn it back to Laura, have you go ahead and get started and see what we can learn today.
All right, so we have a lot to cover in an hour, and I'm going to give you a pretty detailed overview of what we're covering with the hope that it will give you some sense of if you have a question when we're going to address your question. That being said, as questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat. We have some of our trusted colleagues on the line who are monitoring the chat. And because we received questions from many of you beforehand, hopefully your question will be answered in the course of the presentation. If we don't get through everything, because we do have such a packed agenda, we have pretty detailed slides, more detailed than normally I would do a presentation, but I really wanted you guys to be able to use these slides as a resource. You could pull them back up and have a full answer there. So let me just give you an overview of what we'll be covering today. So the first thing is which vaccine mandates apply to various employers. And so that's just the sort of nuts and bolts. I know we've been seeing a lot of things flying around about various mandates. So I'm going to help you navigate for your company. Does a mandate even apply to you? And if so, which one? Then we're going to turn it over to Pam, and she's going to talk about how to facilitate testing for employees. And frankly, this is the part I'm the most excited about because I think that this is the part that you can't just get by Googling or looking at different information. It's like insider, practical, okay, how do we actually get testing for our employees if we decide that's what we want to do? And then finally, we're going to go through the questions that we received. And thank you so much to everyone who sent in a question. We got a lot of questions, which is great. It shows that there's interest in this. And so we've grouped those questions into the following subtopics. So the first is religious exemption requests, a lot of questions around that, medical exemption requests, disability exemption requests, what to do if you think your employee is providing you with false information, what your options are, what accommodations are available, what employers can do if they do need to provide an accommodation. And then finally, pay issues that are related to vaccines. Do you need to pay someone to get their vaccine? What about if you want to provide incentives? All that fun stuff. So that's what we're going to be covering today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive on in. So first, big question, and this is what I always think of when one of my clients call me is, well, let's see, does a mandate even apply to you? It may be that one does not. So we're going to start with the governor's executive order, because I think that's been getting a lot of attention from folks lately. So first thing, ask yourself, do you employ a healthcare worker, teacher, or state executive branch employees in Oregon? Because if so, the state of Oregon mandates may apply to you. And that is going into effect by next week. So it's coming right up. So employees are required to get a vaccine by October 18th. And if you're anything like me, it's hard to believe that October 18th is next week, but we are like well into October. It does not allow for testing as an alternative. And this is significantly different from the federal OSHA mandate that I think a lot of people have heard about, which does allow for testing as an alternative. The state one, the executive order, does not. However, of course, medical and religious exemptions are available. And this could also extend to even if you are not a executive branch employee, if you're a company that's a contractor and does work for the executive branch, if you're going to be working inside state buildings for longer than 15 minutes, it applies to you as well. However, if you're a company that does like utility work or something outside, then it would not apply to you. So now let's go to our friends to the north. I know we have some Washington employers on the line. Very similar mandate between Oregon and Washington. So state of Washington also has a mandate required by October 18th, does not allow for testing as an alternative. There are medical and religious exemptions available, and that includes contractors and volunteers. So there's not that exception if you're inside for 15 minutes. It's a little broader than that. Okay, so now let's think about, okay, and you're like, well, I'm good. I'm not a healthcare worker and I'm not doing work for the executive branch, but are you a large employer? Do you employ more than 100 people across your company? And if so, the federal OSHA mandate applies to you. And I want to make sure people understand what that means, more than 100 people across your company. It really is holistic. So even if you have 20 offices and there's only 5 people in each office, you know, that is still 100 people. But if you have one office that has 80 people, that's not. So it really is across the entire company. So in that case, your employees either need to be vaccinated or they can submit to weekly testing. And of course, medical religious exemptions are available. And what's interesting about this is that the rule hasn't issued yet. So the timeline is to be determined. And I would guess that once the rule does come out, there will be a grace period of several months. So some of my clients have asked me, you know, well, how quickly do I need to comply with this and you know, get my ducks in a row? I think it's always better to be ahead of the curve instead of trying to play catch up. So I would recommend that you start thinking now about how you're going to implement this and what your policies are going to be, and start acclimating it with your workforce. But technically you won't be required to comply until the rules are issued. And this last point is one that I think maybe is lost upon people and could be helpful for those particularly in the services industry, like legal services, CPAs, things like that. It does not apply to full remote employees who do not come to the office. So if you are able to have an employee work fully remotely, then you don't need to worry about having them either get a vaccine or do this weekly testing. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's assume that you don't belong to any of those categories. You know, you're under 100 employees, you're not doing the work for the state, you're not a healthcare worker, you know, you're just a private company doing your own thing. So what are your options, or what, if anything, are the requirements of what you need to do? Well, there's no government mandate that applies to you, but if you want, you may impose your own mandate. And I will say that this has been the majority of questions I've gotten from my clients. Many of my clients are, you know, small local business owners, and they're just trying to figure out what they need to do. So you don't need to do necessarily anything on this, but what can you do? So let's talk a little bit about that. So first, requiring employees to be vaccinated does not present a discrimination problem. I think there was a lot of questions around that initially, like, well, can I require that? Is that some sort of discrimination? And the answer to that is no. And some of you may be aware that in Oregon, recently a group of state troopers tried to challenge the executive order, the vaccine mandate. And there's an opinion by Justice Landau, which is actually really interesting read. If anyone wants, I'm happy to share it. It's not that long, and it's a pretty good read because it just kind of explains, I think, a lot of the chatter that we hear around vaccines. You know, it's a constitutional violation, it's this, that, and the other. And the justice explains pretty clearly why under Oregon law this is permissible. So if anyone thinks that might be helpful to them and guiding them on how to have these conversations, I'm happy to share that information. But just know that it does not present a discrimination problem. The other thing I hear is some of my clients ask, well, isn't this an issue with HIPAA? I can't ask my employees about their vaccination status. It's not a HIPAA issue. And we'll talk about this more in a moment, but HIPAA actually does not apply in the context of employer and employee. So it does not create a HIPAA problem. And we can talk a little more about that. Of course, whatever policy you adopt, you should still make medical and religious exemptions available. And then the final thing I will say is just do keep in mind that local governments can't require police, fire, corrections and probation officers, or healthcare workers to be vaccinated absent a state rule or statute. And so it gets a little confusing because healthcare workers, for example, I started the presentation by saying, if you're a healthcare worker, you're subject to the executive order. So there is a kind of a patchwork around, generally local governments can't require these things, but the governor does have powers now because of the executive order to issue these rules. So if you're not sure, if you're getting confused, that's when you can call me or send me an email and we can help work through if you're not sure where you fall. So the other thing I will say is there are some employers who, even before the federal announcement came out, had their own vaccine mandates in the absence of an applicable government mandate. Now, I will say all these employers now, since they have over 100 employees, would be subject to the federal mandate. But the point is that even before we knew there was going to be a federal mandate, these employers had come to their own policies about having vaccination requirements. So it's not unheard of. A number of companies are deciding to do that for various business reasons. And from what I have seen, most companies who are not subject to a mandate are taking the approach of either their employees need to be vaccinated or they have the alternative to do the testing. So with that, I will turn it over to Pam in case you're one of those players who thinks, okay, I want to provide that alternative. What the heck does that even look like? How do people get tested? So Pam?
Sure. So I'm going to move to that next slide.
Okay.
Laura, because I think you're the host, sorry.
No problem.
All right, I think the best place to start is to understanding what types of tests are available, what do they mean, and then how do they potentially fit in or not fit into a testing program. And then we'll talk a little bit about what does a testing program potentially look like. So first test is a nucleic acid-based test, and you would know this as NAAT or a PCR test. So this is a diagnostic test, and it is looking for an active infection. It is lab analyzed, so typically that means it's not going to be rapid. It's going to go off to a laboratory. It's going to take maybe 24 hours and maybe several days. It just depends. You've probably all seen lab backup issues with your drug testing and also with your COVID testing. However, it's very accurate because it does go through that process. And where do you get this kind of a test? This is the kind of test you go to a clinic, a Quest, AFC Urgent Care, Legacy Go Health, you go to a pharmacy, a drive-through clinic, something like that. Now, what does it cost? It's expensive. I talked to a couple of different insurance agencies, and both said that when it comes to surveillance testing, what they call surveillance testing, they will not be covering it. So we're talking $150 to $200 a test. And the insurance companies call surveillance testing means when a member has chosen not to vaccinate and the company requires testing, therefore it's surveillance, they're not going to cover it. Now, if you were symptomatic or if there was exposure, that's different. So you're probably going to get covered in that case. This is probably not going to be a great option for a weekly testing program because it's going to be super expensive. It's going to take a lot of time. Your employee is going to go in and test, and then they're going to wait a couple of days. So it's probably not going to work out very well. But it is the way to test if you do have an exposure or something like that, or symptomatic. So the second type of test is called an antigen test, and this is a rapid test. So most of you are familiar with more of a rapid test. This is also a diagnostic test. It's also looking for infection, and it is not lab analyzed. So when something's not lab analyzed, it always means the accuracy levels are going to be not as good, right? And so it's not a confirmed test in the same sense, it's more of a pre-screen. It is an option for weekly testing. if you were to have a positive test, I wouldn't necessarily rely on it. I would send your employee off to their healthcare provider to confirm that, or however they want to confirm that. So these tests, there's a lot of them on the market, and some of them only are FDA approved for emergency use authorization. So you really would prefer to use that kind of test, because otherwise, who knows what you're even getting, right? So a couple of those would be Binax Now and IntelliSwab. These are some of the ones that we work with. So these are fairly accurate, especially for a negative test. We're talking about 98% on a negative test, so that's pretty good. I'm talking, this is our IntelliSwab statistics, by the way, and 84% on the positive. So the thing is that it may miss infections at a low viral load. So if you're asymptomatic or you're just not very sick, it is possible to miss that. And where do we get these tests? So lots of clinics and pharmacies also have rapid tests available, so you can go to any of those kind of clinics. You can also be an over-the-counter product. And so that's easy to say, it's an over-the-counter product. However, getting it right now is the issue. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. What do they cost? A clinic is going to charge, I made a couple calls, I heard $120. I heard $50 plus a site fee for Oregon on-site. They will actually come and do the testing. So if you have a lot of people that need to test, you might bring an on-site mobile testing unit out. They will set up weekly appointments. AFC Urgent Care will do that as well. But they have to have time and they have to know in advance, and there usually has to be a minimum number of people. So the getting it as an over-the-counter product is, I think, eventually going to be a very simple situation. Right now, it's actually quite difficult. So I went online, I saw the 2 FDA approved products that we work with, and those were completely not available, not at Walmart.com where they're supposed to be, not anywhere I could find them. There was all sorts of other tests I've never heard of that were $100, $1,000, all sorts of different things. And those were available, but I don't know anything about them, and I don't know how you would find out anything about them. However, the government has provided grants to the manufacturers of these over-the-counter tests. And they've just received them. They're in the millions and millions of dollars. These will become available. It's just basically like the vaccine, right? Everybody wanted it. It wasn't enough. We were all going crazy trying to get vaccines. And then all of a sudden we have plenty. So I think the same thing's going to happen with the testing, because again, now all of a sudden everybody needs it. We didn't think we were all going to need it right now, and they have the grants, but what does this mean? Oh, I have to find a new building and find more equipment, and hire people. That's not difficult these days, get some more supplies. So once all these things come together, I think those over-the-counter tests are going to be much more available. We are selling them right now. We occasionally get a couple of them to go out the door, but we don't have any ETAs or anything like that. They're all just like, as soon as we get them, we ship them out. So that's where those are at the moment. But I do think, like I said, that's going to clear up. I just don't know when. So the third test is an antibody test. This is a blood test. You don't really need to worry about this for a testing program. It's only going to show if someone already had the virus and has the antibodies for it. So it's just not something really necessary for a weekly testing program. If you can flip to the next slide, Laura.
Yep.
Okay, so how to test. Here's what I'm finding is happening in the industry so far between the labs I've talked to and the employers that we've talked to. There's basically 2 options. You send people to a clinic, or you find an over-the-counter system that works for you. So let's think about some of the considerations for the clinics. It's probably going to be pretty expensive, and then who's going to pay? I have heard all 3 options of who's paying. I've heard the employer pays for it, I've heard the employee pays for it, and I've heard they split the cost. So these are all things that, we can't tell you. Maybe Laura can, but she can advise you. I can't. I see a question, is the test covered by insurance? Not if it's a weekly surveillance test. It is covered if it's symptomatic. Now, I don't know if you went in and, said there was an exposure or something, could they cover it? Yes, but if you go in every week, that probably isn't going to last very long. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and the employer is going to need to cover it. The employer is requiring it as a condition of employment. The employer needs to pay for it.
Okay. Guess
Yeah.
what? That's not what's always happening out there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear that people are going to make
Yeah,
their employees pay for it.
Yeah, so that's the cost. The other thing is going to be, the other questions you're going to have for Laura or someone else are your timing. Do they have to do this over the weekend? Are they going during work hours? What if they can't get an appointment? So what I'm hearing mostly from the clinics is that a lot of employers are saying, go get an appointment, come in every week with your result. Some of them are saying, we're going to set up someone weekly to come in and test. And so, and or we're going to, set appointments for you to send you weekly. I think it probably makes a big difference on if you have 2 employees in this situation or, 30. So when you're going to do it, are they going to be able to find an appointment? Because that's another issue. I mean, yes, you can still get appointments. I called several places this week, and as long as it's a few days ahead, we were able, I was able to get an appointment if I wanted to. And then another question for your attorney or someone else is, what do you do about missed work time? What if people are missing work? Are they using PTO? Are they, do you have them going off hours to get their testing done? So again, this is all new for us. So I don't have the perfect answers for you. I have a lot of more questions.
Well,
However,
at least can answer that last question, Pam, about the missed work time. So employers, you need to pay for that, but you can require that your employees use PTO or sick time they have saved up.
Perfect.
But for the other stuff, yeah, it's a lot of questions.
And again, this is once again all new for us again. So here we are now in another whole situation where we have to figure it out. These are the things I'm seeing so far. And do you want to switch to the next slide then, Laura?
Yep. Let me see if I can get that. There you go.
All right. The other option, and I know employers who are doing this right now, is they are purchasing over-the-counter rapid testing, and they are either having the applicant test in the office, or sorry, not the applicant. I'm in the drug screening business. I'm used to talking applicants. Having the employee test in the office or having them test at home. So considerations, the cost is not bad, actually. I think that especially with the government subsidizing, which is going to be happening, and we're talking like $10. I've seen them for between $10 and $50 a test, if you can get them. And so that's the problem. Again, we're having a hard time right now getting the testing. And then where to test? Who are you going to test in the office? And if so, who's going to manage that? Is the HR department going to have people come in and test when they get there in the morning, that sort of thing? Or who's going to manage it? And when will this be scheduled during work time? Those are some more questions. If it's at home, I know clients who are doing this right now, how are you going to verify the testing was done accurately, that it was done on a timely basis? Are you going to have them send in a photo? Is it going to have a date stamp on it? How do you know the employee actually tested themselves rather than someone else in the house? So there are some options for telehealth apps where someone will actually watch your employee, or you can get on Zoom and watch your employee. But again, how are you going to manage this? So all of the different options right now come with their own set of questions and concerns. But right now, these are the options that are available.
And I do want to clarify, sorry, I think I may have conflated ideas. For the time that the employee has to do for the test, like if you're requiring an employee to go offsite or whatever, employer has to pay for that. But for the test itself, that's up to employer policy. So the employer can decide to pay for it, or they can make employees pay for it. But the time itself, and for the time itself, you can require an employee to use PTO or sick time, whatever they have saved up. If you as a company decide you're going to allow testing as an alternative, then to your policy, you can decide who's going to actually pay for the test, but when it comes to that time of taking the test. So I think I conflated those two when I spoke earlier. I was being too general. So hopefully that answers. I saw some of the questions coming up in the chat.
So Laura, just to clarify, sorry. So
yeah.
Time to test, we're paying, but we can require that they use PTO or sick, which is essentially paying.
Yes.
Perfect.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, go ahead.
Okay. So
turn it back to Laura.
Thank you. All right, Pam, perfect timing, because that now leaves the remainder of our time to go through all the questions that we received from you guys ahead of time. So we're going to dive in. And like I said at the beginning, there's going to be more text on these screens that normally would be in a presentation. So just bear with me. But the thought being, hopefully that you could print this out, save this on your desktop, and use this as a resource. So first question, and I would say this is where I found the most questions, is what in the world are we supposed to do with these religious exemptions? So let's just start big picture. What counts as a religious objection, right? So just, these are some examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully this is helpful for people to kind of understand what is the religious objection and what isn't. So on the left-hand side, here are some examples of what would be, if your employee said this was their objection, it would be a valid religious objection. So, moral discomfort with the use of stem cells in vaccine research, or belief that receiving the vaccine constitutes the mark of the beast, or adherence to a religion that prohibits all vaccinations, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses. However, on the other hand, and these are some common objections to the vaccine, but they would not fall under a religious exemption, is the feeling that the vaccine was developed too quickly, or a belief that the mandates are government overreach, or disagreement with the science of vaccines, or preferring to rely on natural immunity. We're not here to comment one way or another on the validity or strength on any of those arguments or opinions, but they don't qualify as a religious objection, such to be a religious exemption under either your policy or the mandates. So that then leads to the next question from a lot of my clients. Well, how am I supposed to evaluate this, right? A medical or disability exemption could come with some evidence, from a doctor. How do employees demonstrate a religious exemption? And the answer is, for once, thank you, OHA, there's a form. So there actually is a government approved form that you can use with your employees. The Oregon Health Authorities provided this form online. It can also be printed. And what it does is it asks for the employee to give a brief written description of their religious objection to the vaccine, and it asks them to sign it. So I'm just going to show you what the form looks like. So there it is, beautiful OHA form. And a couple of things I think are interesting. The first, of course, is the narrative part. What I like about that is then it's not the employer like cross-examining their employee. It's just the asking the employee, okay, will you tell me what your religious exemption is? And then also notice that it does have a certification above the signature, kind of 2/3 down. It says, I certify the above information to be true and accurate, and that I sincerely hold the religious belief described above. So, and then also, of course, note the language underneath that workplaces are not required to provide this exemption accommodation if doing so would pose a direct threat to the accepted individual or others in the workplace, or would create an undue hardship. So we'll talk about that more in a moment, but I do think that this form could be very helpful. And one of the questions was, how does sincerely held religious belief play into us, or does it? And yeah, the question's from someone I know who's a very smart individual, and they figured it out. Yep, you have to take them essentially at their word, pretty much. I will say that there are some, exceptions to that. So for instance, you can ask your employees about this form, and you can ask for a written narrative, and you can use the form to ask for additional narrative and additional questions. I will say that you can ask follow-up questions. That's not prohibited. You can engage in a conversation about the religious belief and ask questions. For example, and again, I'm not recommending this, but I do know that one employer, for instance, an employee said their objection was to the stem cells. Well, stem cells were also used in the development of Tums and Tylenol. And so they asked that employee, well, have you ever used Tums or Tylenol? So, I mean, logically, that is an accurate line of thought. I am not recommending that you necessarily go to that level of detail with your employees. Essentially, I mean, this is a tricky area, and this is an area I think where we will see some pushback. Now, that being said, and we'll get into this in a moment when we start talking about the medical exemptions and other exemptions, it is fair to ask if they've received other vaccines. right? Because if they've received other vaccines that would not be supported by this religious exemption, that might suggest that maybe this isn't a sincerely held belief. However, if they come back and say, well, I'm a recent convert or whatever, that's where you are. So on this area in particular, and that's why I started with the religious exemption, I think it's a hard one. I would say start with the form. Hopefully the employee has enough integrity if they're signing something and they have to certify that's true and accurate, they're going to be honest. If you really feel like they're not and you're not sure where to turn from there, feel free to reach out to me, give me a call. We can talk through it because it's not an easy area. But as I have on the screen here, just try to document the conversations you've had around it, keep those confidential, but really try not to delve too much, I don't think, into your employees' deepest spiritual beliefs. So this is not an easy one, but hopefully the form will help a bit. Okay, so, and then that kind of, I think, ties into this last slide here, which says, what do I do if I'm not sure whether my employee is being sincere? I'll just say that generally, I think it's best to give them the benefit of the doubt. But if you truly think that it's not true, and this is just like a brand new thing, I think someone in the chat mentioned something about COVID roulette. This seems like it's just the latest thing they're doing, then just document the reasons as to why you're denying it. And just keep in mind that at the end, if you have to explain this to someone, you want to have it clearly documented of what you did and how you're evaluating this request and why you came to the conclusion you're coming to. And you don't want any of that documentation to suggest that you somehow discriminate against their beliefs, that you think, well, that's silly that you believe that, but rather it doesn't seem sincere in the case of someone who's doing the COVID exemption roulette. I like that phrase and I might try to use that from now on. Okay, so next one is medical exemption requests. So this one I think is a little more, hopefully a little more straightforward, right? So if you have an employee that comes to you with a medical exemption request, let's first think about what are the medical conditions that would prevent a person from getting a vaccine. And it's interesting to know that in the context of these vaccines, these COVID vaccines, it's pretty narrow. There's just one, and that is a severe allergic reaction to one of the ingredients of the vaccine that would result in anaphylaxis. So even folks who are immunocompromised and even, for instance, pregnant women can receive the vaccine. And some people were like, really? And the answer is yes. And the reason for that is that the COVID-19 vaccines don't contain a live virus. And so therefore they actually are different than some of the medical risks that other vaccines present. Now, I don't expect any of you to be medical experts, neither am I as an attorney. So I just gave you some links to the CDC that explains that. But I do think it is important to understand that this is different from most vaccines. And that actually might be a point of education and hopefully helpful as you're having these conversations with your employees. People may just not know, they may not understand. And so maybe if they understand this, it would help alleviate some of their concerns. So what is the information you can ask for if an employee wants to request a medical exemption? And fortunately, this is not new, right? We've been doing this with schools for a long time with vaccines. So you can ask the following information, which is the same information schools require from students when they're seeking a medical exemption for vaccines. And so I have the list here on the slide. And you may notice that one of them does include a list of vaccines contraindicated. And again, that's a suggestion of, well, what other vaccines have you not been able to receive because of your medical condition? So that can also be helpful information and can speak to sort of the COVID roulette that we've mentioned earlier, right? Okay, let's see here. So now, can I request medical records from my employees? So this is another one I get a lot from my clients. Like, well, isn't that a HIPAA violation? Or they have their employees telling them, you can't ask for that, you're violating HIPAA. That's actually not accurate, right? So HIPAA does not apply to employer-employee interactions. You can ask the employee for medical documentation. You can ask them for records of COVID vaccinations and past vaccination records. That's fair game. Now, it is true that if you do want a medical release signed by the employee, that if you want something from their doctor, then the employee is going to have to sign a medical release, because those, hospitals, physicians, they are covered by HIPAA. So that it is true that you will need to get a release from your employee in that condition. And just in case you're wondering what is HIPAA, I think people have heard a lot, but they don't necessarily know what it is. So this will be your moment of legal education. It's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. But basically it prevents healthcare providers from sharing your medical information without your permission. So HIPAA, again, just in summary, it does not prohibit people from asking you about your own medical information, and it doesn't protect you from providing it in relevant situations, like in this situation, if the workplace has a vaccine mandate. So that includes providing information relevant to vaccine exemptions. That being said, I'm not saying that we don't have to worry about privacy. Of course we do, but this falls into hopefully the usual bucket as employers that we're accustomed to, which is, employees' medical records and information should be kept confidential. Employees should be comfortable that you're not going to share their information with coworkers. That would be inappropriate. You should have a separate file, their personnel file for these medical records. And of course, in general, don't use this as an opportunity to delve into people's medical information. You just need to ask for information that's relevant to the vaccine issue. But I don't think many employers want to get into this anyway. So hopefully that's not too much of a concern. All right, let's see here. So disability exemptions. And I'll just take a quick look at the chat. So if an employee denies providing the vaccine records, you can't, that's one of the questions in chat, then you can, that can be grounds for termination. They have to participate, right? And if they're not going to give you even their records, then you can let them go. But again, document all of this, but they have to engage with you. They can't just say they're not going to do it and then you're stuck and you can't go anywhere from there. Okay, disability exemption requests. So how do I handle a request for a disability exemption? So remember, we talked about religious exemption, medical, and now this with disability. So for those of you who in Oregon have more than 6 employees, or under federal law, more than 15, hopefully you have some experience with disability requests and accommodations under the Americans with Disability Act, under the ADA. So, and the good news is that it's basically the same process, right? You're handling these requests for accommodations the same way you would under the ADA. So you have to engage in the interactive process, you have to talk to your employee, you keep it confidential, and offer what reasonable accommodation is possible. But just like with the ADA, this is not an absolute requirement. You have to engage with them, try to find accommodation, but if there is not an accommodation that can be found without posing an undue hardship, then you can terminate the employee. It's pretty extreme, but it is possible. I just want to make that clear out there. And I'm not recommending that you jump to that and that you jump to termination, but I do want you to know that it's the same process as you would use under the ADA. So what disabilities would prevent a person from receiving the COVID vaccine? And this is where it gets tricky, because technically, according to the EEOC, none. I mean, really, and other areas too, OSHA and other, none. There are no disabilities that should prevent a person from receiving the COVID vaccine. But here are some things that could come up. So, for example, if you do have a pregnant employee, the EEOC encourages employers to treat pregnancy, although it were a disability, even though it's in this context, even though it's not technically a disability under the ADA. And so if you have an employee who is pregnant or breastfeeding, my recommendation is that you try to accommodate them to the extent possible. One example, if your field would allow it, perhaps remote work or other things, because the other thing you want to try to avoid is then like crossing over into the land of pregnancy discrimination. Hopefully, in particular in the case of pregnancy or breastfeeding, hopefully it's a limited duration that doesn't create such a undue hardship. But if you're really banging your head against the wall, like coming into a problem with that, again, feel free to reach out. We can brainstorm on what your options might be. And then there are other potential disabilities, right? So some people, for example, could have a true phobia of needles or doctor's offices. If that were the case, that would be the type of employee, for example, where I would ask them, okay, well, what have you done in the past when you've needed to receive a shot, right? And if they say, well, I've never received a shot in my entire life because my phobia is so strong, ask to see some medical records to support that. If that truly is the case, then think about what your options might be for accommodation, remote work, unpaid leave, et cetera. But it may not be the case. It might be that if you actually look at their medical records, no, they have found ways to get shots before. And then finally, just as a general note, just keep in mind that some disabilities may make it difficult for an employee to access the vaccine. I can't think of any specific examples right now, but what I'm trying to convey with that point is just try to be flexible as you're thinking about how to administer this program if you decide to have a mandatory vaccine program, and think about what accommodations might be available for folks. Okay, so we received a number of questions around this too. What do we do if we think an employee provided false information? Which shocking, I know, because employees never exaggerate about things or try to play COVID exemption roulette. But if that were to happen, you do have some options. So, for example, what do I do if I believe an employee has provided false medical information to gain an exemption? So first, you can ask for the employee's medical records if you think there's something inconsistent about what the note they're presenting now versus their past medical history. Or you can have a phone call with the employee's primary medical care provider. And if an employee will not comply with that request, you can deny the exemption. And document all this in writing. And of course, that goes for any exemption that you deny. You want to keep a written file in as much detail as possible, including what information you asked for that wasn't provided, because an employee can't just get around this by not providing information. And also keep in mind that if you think that an employee basically is in cahoots with their doctor, I mean, one question received is, what if we have a bunch of doctors and they're all writing notes for each other, right? And they're all doing this together. Well, then like with FEMLA, you actually can choose a physician that the employee sees. So send them to a doctor that's not in that little cabal of COVID roulette. And so just in the context as an FMLA claim, you can require the employee to see a physician of your choice if you suspect their physician is not providing accurate information. Whoever thought we would need to do that, right? Okay, so let's assume that you go through this process, right? You say as a company, all right, we have a vaccine mandate. We're not gonna offer alternative testing, just you have to be vaccinated. You have some employees come and you determine, all right, you either have a valid religious, medical, or disability exemption. So now what? So what are the available accommodations, right? So first, I would say, just keep in mind what mandate applies to you. So if you're subject, for example, to the OSHA mandate, the federal mandate 100 employees, then in that case, I think weekly testing is the best accommodation. The employee can still be in the office, they can still show up, but just get the weekly testing. Another option, another accommodation could be full remote work. That's an accommodation that gets around the mandate completely. And then finally, and this is a tricky one, but just keep in mind that there is an accommodation option of unpaid leave. So what can be tricky about the unpaid leave is we get questions around, well, do you have to still pay for their benefits, right? How does that work? And the answer is probably yes, right? I mean, take a look at what your plan provides, but generally speaking, under ADA, if someone's on unpaid leave, you have to continue their benefits. And for some employers, that can be really expensive. And I think there could be a sense of, so I'm getting zero productivity out of this employee because for whatever reason, imagine, for example, you have a job where an employee has to come in. There is no possibility for remote work. So they're on unpaid leave, you're getting no productivity out of them, and yet you still have to pay for their health benefits. I know that can feel like a tough pill to swallow. On the other hand, with unpaid leave, I mean, there's a number of employees who could only do that for so long. So it might be that the situation resolves itself in a relatively quick manner. But I'm just approaching this from a legal perspective. And, one thing I do want you to keep in mind is that if you can't do the weekly testing, and full remote work is not a possibility, unpaid leave is an accommodation possibility. Okay, but what if you're subject to the state of Oregon mandate? Well, then testing and remote work are not workarounds, right? In that case, if you are a healthcare worker or one of those people who's doing contract work for the state for more than 15 minutes inside, essentially your only accommodation option is unpaid leave to employees who want and qualify for the exemption. All right, now this is the big question, right? This is the $64,000 question. And this is the question I think that will be the subject of litigation to come. Can I fire an employee for refusing to get vaccinated? And let me just first start with, I don't normally answer questions with yes and no, because that seems like a very unsatisfactory answer. But I think that is the most correct answer in this case. So yes and no. On the one hand, you are required to accommodate an employee if possible, if they qualify for one of the exemptions we talked about, religious, medical, disability. However, just like under the ADA, if the accommodation is not possible or presents an undue hardship, you can fire the employee. And do keep in mind that religious exemptions in particular only need to be accommodated at de minimis cost to the employer. So that is technically the rule. And I will note that in Washington, Governor Inslee has said that employees who refuse to be vaccinated by October 18th may be terminated. But of course, if an employee who qualifies for an accommodation, they can't be terminated just because they qualify for the accommodation. In that case, they may be placed on unpaid leave, or you'll need to make a demonstration of the undue hardship. So this is a tricky one, right? I think this is the crux of the dilemma for many employers. What do you do if you have an employee who just refused to get vaccinated? I think it's easier if the employee does not qualify for any of the exemptions. So if they don't have the medical, disability, or religious exemption, and they just won't be vaccinated, then you are within your rights to end their employment. I mean, that it's a condition of employment to have your employees vaccinated if that's the path you take. I think where it gets more complicated is if they do qualify for an accommodation. And then the question is just, does it present an undue hardship? My advice there is if you have an employee who has qualified for an exemption, but you're kind of bang your head against the wall and just think it's an undue hardship, you're not sure how you're going to accommodate this, I recommend that you call me or whoever you normally work with. I'm not trying to be greedy here, call anyone. It doesn't have to be me, but I do recommend at that point that you do consult with an attorney. If for nothing else, the outcome may be the same, but I think you want to get your file in shape, right? You want to make sure you have your ducks in a row, have the documentation that you need, and really that you've thought through what your possible accommodations might be. So that would be my recommendation on that point. Okay, then the final kind of category of questions that we've received from folks are these pay issues related to vaccines. So the first is, I think one that we addressed earlier, which is if an employer requires a vaccine voluntarily or by mandate, do they need to pay employees for the time off to get it? And the answer is yes, but you can require them to take PTO or sick time if they've already accrued. So where it gets a little more complicated was the question we were talking about earlier, where, okay, but then who pays for the testing itself, right? Is that the employer? Is that the employee? And that gets a little more complicated. So the top line answer is that technically the employer does not have to pay. But where it gets complicated is if the testing is part of the reasonable accommodation, right? Because one of your employees qualifies for an accommodation, then the employer does need to pay. Or if there's if it's a business related expense, then the employer does need to pay. So on that, what I'd like to do with this group, for the people who are on this call, is send you out kind of a little cheat sheet on that, because I think it's more than just what can be covered on, on one slide. So I'll send you guys follow-up information on kind of the different categories of when you might need to pay for the testing. On the question of the time the employer has to pay, and that's either PTO or sick time, but who pays for the actual test? I'll send you out additional information. And Pam, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you a question.
Yeah.
That I hope will be interesting to other people. Can you require that they test during the weekend? And then if so, do you pay them
Yeah.
just an hour or whatever it took them to go test?
Yeah, you can require, it's not illegal to have people work on the weekend. Just ask anyone who works the week. No, I'm just kidding. But yes, you do need to require them. So if you're going to require them to do on the weekend, and then the thing to keep in mind, in particular, if you have employees who are subject to overtime, they get overtime pay. And if that weekend work's going to kick them into overtime, then just make sure you're being cognizant of that, because that's going to be considered work time to have them get tested, and you will need to pay them for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so what about incentives? That's another question I've received. Can I use incentive to encourage my employees to get vaccinated? And the answer is yes, but for any of you who've done incentives in the workplace before, like health incentives, people are going to the gym, or if their weight is a certain thing, or blood levels, they get better insurance. All of that, you just need to be aware it falls into the same rules, right? Those are all going to be wellness programs. So yes, but keep in mind that all incentives count as wellness programs, and therefore they have to comply with wellness program requirements. The kind of top line consideration there is that whatever the cost is that you're giving people, whatever the benefit is, the incentive, it can't exceed 30% of the total employee only cost of health insurance. So I put a link on there to the Department of Labor with more information on that. But just keep in mind, you have to treat this the same way you treat any other wellness plan. So if you already have a wellness plan in place, hopefully you kind of understand the guardrails on that. If you don't, and this is new territory for you, then you can take a look at the Department of Labor link that is in the slide. And what if you want to go the other way? How else can you encourage them? Obviously, so before we get into what Delta Airlines is doing, which is that they're using a fine, which I was kind of surprised to see, but that's one option. I honestly, and maybe I'm just being a little naive here, I think it's worth having a conversation with your employees. I think there's a lot of misinformation going on about these vaccines right now. Reasonable minds can differ, but some things on, maybe they don't realize that it doesn't have a live vaccine in, or live, they just didn't realize that part, it's no live virus, in the vaccine. And if they knew that, then they feel better about it. So that might be an option. You may just having some education and conversation with your employees. But that being said, if you're done talking and people are being unreasonable or in your mind and you want to do a fine, that's a possibility as well. So Delta Airlines, for instance, is fining pilots and flight attendants $200 per month if they don't get vaccinated, rather than requiring them to do so. It's legal. I just don't know how good it'd be for morale. But so I'm not necessarily recommending that, just letting you know that that is what at least one company is doing. Okay, maybe you say, okay, yeah, fine, but I really don't want to fine my employees. So, what else can I do? And one possibility would be to increase PTO with the creation of something like a floating COVID-19 holiday that employees could use to get vaccinated or just take the day off. Don't we all just deserve a day off at this point, especially having to deal with all this vaccine fun. So, and that will bring us to another big question I've been getting.
We do have a hand raised, Laura.
Oh, okay, sure.
Anna, did you have a question about that topic?
Yes, I did. I've been hearing, Laura, that some insurance companies are charging premiums to people that are unvaccinated, and that those increased insurance charges can be passed on to the employees that refuse to get vaccinated. Is that another consideration? Yes,
I think that is another consideration. That's another option as well.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. For instance, some workplaces may know that there's increased insurance premiums for people who smoke, and they pass that along to the employee. And so I think it's a similar analogy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so can I be sued if my employees don't get vaccinated? Again, not a great answer, unclear, right? That's not like the most helpful answer, but we are in uncharted territories. So here's what I would say on that. If you're subject to the OSHA mandate, let's say you have more than 100 employees, your employees could file a complaint, right? Let's say you're required to have people get vaccinated and you're just not doing it. And then that could carry the same consequences as any other OSHA complaint. So think of it as like a workplace safety issue. The same way if you're required to keep the warehouse floor clear of tractors or dangerous things and you do nothing about it, then a complaint could be filed. Likewise, if this is now an OSHA issue and it's a workplace safety issue that you're supposed to have your workforce vaccinated and you're not doing anything to try to comply with it, technically one of your employees could file a complaint and OSHA could come in and do an investigation. So to our knowledge, at this point, no Oregon employer has been sued for having unvaccinated employees. Again, I'd be surprised if that would happen, but I have been surprised before by some of the things that people sue for. And again, I would say what's helpful is relying on similar analogies that we really deal with. So treat this as you would any other OSHA issue. Okay, that brings us to our final slide. I don't normally end presentations on legal issues with the word kind. It's not usually part of how I operate as an attorney or, inform things, but I just want to put this out here. I think that it is helpful to keep in mind that there's a lot of pressures on both sides. My clients are under a lot of pressure to comply with the law, which seems to change every 3 weeks. I mean, it's really hard to operate a company and operate a business when the laws keep changing and they have a cost and we don't know who pays for what. It's really stressful. So on the one hand, and I, being a business owner myself, I'm an owner of my firm, I really empathize with that. It is hard. On the other hand, keep in mind that if you have, let's say you've decided to implement a vaccine mandate and you have some employees who do not want to get vaccinated, and that can seem very frustrating because you're just trying to either comply with the mandate that you've received or something your company's agreed upon. You don't know what people are going through, right? They could be facing pressure from their family, their friends, or their faith communities. The faith communities in particular can be really hard if people feel like they're going to be ostracized from their church or their community if they get vaccinated. So, they could be afraid, they could be misinformed. I would just say try to treat people as kindly as possible throughout the process. Not only is it good for morale, but it probably will reduce lawsuits, which is also good for the bottom line. So it will pay off for you and them in the long run. That being said, this is not an easy area to navigate. Pam and I are happy to help however we can. We have put our contact information in these slides because we do want to encourage you guys, if you have questions, please reach out to us, email us, call us. We are trying to figure this out as it's happening, as it's unfolding, but we hope to be a resource for anyone. And with that, I think that is it. Pam, anything you want to add?
No, I don't think so. Again, please reach out. Things are changing so quickly that never feel bad about reaching out to ask a question because I sometimes don't know until the next minute anyway. So I'm happy to talk to you. We're both happy to talk to you. And thank you so much for your time today.
Hey guys, we had a question about the slides, and yes, we will be sending out the slides following the presentation.
Yeah, we'll send out the slides, and I'll include that opinion from Justice Landau. You don't have to read it, but I do think for some employers it can be very helpful, because if you're just getting that, well, isn't this a constitutional violation, this, that, and the other? I just thought the way he explained it was very helpful and very clear. So I'll send that out as well. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thank you for trying to do the right thing in your workplace and knowing how to navigate this. Thanks so much.